I have cooked for 3 armies in my life, and only one of them ever frightened me, and it wasn't the one with the most guns. It was the Vor. Not because they were cruel, they weren't particularly no crueler than men, but because they could not stop measuring. Every Vor who walked into my galley sized up every other living thing in the room before he took a breath, the way you or I might glance at the weather. Who was above? Who was below? Who would yield and who would have to be made to? They did it with their crest, with the set of their shoulders, with a low chest note you felt in your teeth more than heard. They did it to each other 1,000 times a shift, and they did it to me. And after a while you stopped noticing, the way you stopped noticing the hum of a fridge. They did it to Nelson too, the first day, and Nelson did not notice it at all, and that was the beginning of everything. I should tell you about Nelson, because if you don't understand Nelson, you won't understand any of it. He was an orange Tom, the rusty kind that goes pale at the muzzle when they get old, and he was old. He had one eye. The other was gone before I ever met him, a clean old scar, healed over years back, on some farm or dock I never knew, because he came to me as a stray off a freight pad on Halloran's World, and decided in the unhurried way of cats that I belonged to him. The vet who looked him over for the transit papers said the eye was an old wound, long settled, no trouble, and charged me for the visit anyway. So when the Vor later wanted to make something mystical of the eye, I always told them the truth, which was that he lost it being a cat somewhere before I knew him, and it never slowed him down by a single supper. He weighed about as much as a sack of sugar. He slept 14 hours of every 20. His favorite place in all the garrison was the stack of flour sacks at the cold end of my galley, where the recycler draft kept the temperature down, and he would lie up there in a loaf with his paws tucked and watch the deck with his one eye half shut, and you would have sworn there was nothing behind that eye but the simple arithmetic of when I might next open a tin. That was what the Vor saw, a small, soft, half-blind earth animal, prey by their reckoning, and the Vor reckoning was a thing they trusted the way other people trust gravity. Cor Senat was a supply garrison, which is a polite way of saying it was the last warm place before a great deal of cold. It sat on the daylit face of a dull yellow world the Vor had no proper name for, only a number, and it ran 2 functions. It moved freight up the line to the forward postings, and it broke and trained war beasts in the annex they all called, without affection, Annex C. I never had cause to go into Annex C, and I never wanted to. My galley shared a bulkhead with it. That was all a thick one, and a set of pressure doors between, and a long curved corridor under a daylight dome where the troopers queued for their rations 3 times a shift. From my counter, I could hear the annex the way you hear a storm 2 valleys over, sounds that didn't belong to anything you'd want close. The Vor fed those beasts on a schedule and trained them on another, and the ones they couldn't train they put down, and the one they couldn't do either with they kept, because he was the best of them, and his name was Hesk. I never saw Hesk in those early weeks. I only heard the handlers talk about him while they ate, the way men talk about a horse that's killed someone, half pride and half dread, and a great deal of explaining about how it wasn't really the beast's fault. It was the last handlers, the one before, you understand, who didn't read him right. A drenhound they called his kind. I'll spare you the Vor biology lecture I got more than once over the steam table. The short of it, as big as a pony, low and broad, plated along the spine, built to run something down and not get up off it. They were pack animals in the wild, which is why the Vor could use them at all. A drenhound would take a place in a hierarchy if you could show it the hierarchy in terms it believed. The Vor did that with dominance, the only language they themselves spoke. You outdisplayed the beast. You made yourself bigger and louder and more certain than it, and you did it without one flicker of doubt, because a drenhound could smell doubt the way Nelson could smell a fish tin through a sealed lid. Hesk had smelled doubt in 3 handlers, and Hesk had decided, in the unhurried way of apex things, that he stood above all 3. That is the whole tragedy of Annex C in one sentence. They kept giving him handlers who, somewhere underneath the crest and the chest note and the certainty, did not entirely believe they were above him. And he knew. The first time the Vor noticed Nelson was a slow afternoon, the dome gone gold overhead, the queue thin. A young trooper named San, they were nearly all named in that clipped Vor way. One hard syllable came through for a bowl and saw the cat up on the flower, and he stopped, and he did the thing. The crest came up half a notch. The chest note started low. He was sizing up my cat. "What is that?" he said. Not a question the way he said it, a verdict in progress. "That's Nelson," I said. "Don't mind him." San leaned in. Nelson opened the one eye, looked at him for about as long as it takes to decide a thing isn't food, and shut it again. And San, I watched it happen, took that for submission. The little earth animal had looked away first. The little earth animal had yielded. He stood up taller, satisfied, the chest note settling into something almost smug. And he told me, in the helpful way of a man explaining the obvious, that the creature was prey-built, eyes set forward like a hunter's but soft, no plate, no crest, no display at all, and half-blind besides, and that it was a wonder my species had survived to leave the homeworld if that was the company we kept. I said it had been touch and go. He didn't get the joke. The Vor almost never got the joke, which was its own quiet pleasure over a long contract. What San had read as submission was a cat declining to be interested. I knew the difference. I'd lived with the difference for years. But you can't explain a cat to a creature that has never been ignored in its life, that doesn't have the category, the way you can't explain silence to a man who's only ever known noise to mean a threat. So I let San have his verdict. He went off pleased to be the apex of the ration queue, and Nelson slept, and the dome went from gold to the flat white of the long Vor day, and that, for a few more weeks, was the shape of things. They made a game of it after that, the troopers. Not a cruel one, I'll give them that, and I watched closely, because a man who will be cruel to a cat will be cruel to a cook eventually. It was more that Nelson became a fixed point in their measuring, a thing safely below them. They'd come off a hard rotation in the annex, scraped raw by whatever Hesk had refused to do that shift, and they'd stop at the flour sacks and loom over the old Tom and do the display crest, shoulders, the chest note, and get the small clean dose of certainty that yes, here at least was a thing they outranked, and go to their bowls steadier for it. Nelson permitted this the way he permitted weather. Sometimes he'd look. Mostly he wouldn't. Once a big sergeant named Voron, the Beastmaster, their best, the only one who'd ever brought Hesk to anything like heel, stood over him a long while doing the full display, the works, the kind that made younger Vor step back, and Nelson yawned at him. Just a yawn, the pink mouth, the curl of the tongue, the slow blink after. And Voron laughed, a real laugh, the bark they did, and said the earth animal had no idea what stood in front of it, which was the only thing he was ever wrong about, and he was wrong about it completely. Because here is what I came to understand slowly over that contract, watching the Vor measure each other and measure me and measure my cat. They could only read a hierarchy that announced itself. Display answered display. Their whole world ran on it. A thing that outdisplayed you was above you. A thing that displayed nothing was beneath you, by definition, because what else could nothing mean? They had no category for an authority that didn't bother to perform. They had never in their long history met a king who couldn't be troubled to wear the crown. Nelson didn't display because Nelson had nothing to prove to a Vor. The same reason he had nothing to prove to a chair, or to the recycler, or to me. He was a cat. The entire architecture of his attention was built around two questions: is it food, and is it a threat? And a Vor trooper doing a chest note over a flour sack answered neither, and so received, correctly, nothing. It would have stayed a quiet, foolish little misunderstanding to the end of my contract, I think, if Hesk had stayed behind his door. He didn't stay behind his door. It was the back of third shift. The dome dialed down to that gray not quite night the Vor used to mark the hours, and I was alone in the galley but for the cat, prepping the early bake, my hands in a trough of gray Vor flour that smelled of nothing, when the annex went wrong. I want to be honest about what I knew in the moment, because afterward people made me into something I wasn't. I didn't know it was Hesk. I knew the sound through the bulkhead changed. The storm 2 valleys over came over the ridge. There was a crash that went through the deck plates and up through my boots, and then the alarm, a Vor alarm, is a falling tone, like something giving up, and then under it the part I'll hear for the rest of my life, which was the handlers. Vor don't scream the way we do. They're proud, even falling. But there is a sound a proud thing makes when the certainty goes out of it all at once, when the floor of the world it stood on opens, and I heard that sound 3 times through the bulkhead in under a minute, and then I didn't hear it anymore, and somehow that was worse. I did the sensible thing. I want that on the record too, because of how the rest goes. I got off the line. I got the pressure door at the galley's far end shut and dogged, and I got my back to the cold bulkhead by the flower, and I stood there with my heart going like a trip hammer, and I did the arithmetic any cook does when the building's coming apart, which is, how do I get out, and what's between me and out? What was between me and out was the curved ration corridor under the dome, and the corridor had 2 ends. One led onto the freight stacks and the lift to the pads, which was my way home. The other led onto Annex C through a set of doors that were supposed to be impossible to open from the beast side. They were open. I could see down the corridor through the galley's serving hatch. The annex doors were peeled, not opened, peeled. The metal turned out like the lid of a tin, and the daylight from the dome lay across the deck in a long gray stripe, and in the stripe, unhurried, came Hesk. I'd never seen him, and I knew him at once. Nothing else it could have been. He was the size they'd said, and worse for being real low, plated, the head wide and blunt and carried level, and he moved the way a thing moves when it has stopped having anywhere it needs to be. He came down the corridor into the ration queues space, into the open, into the daylight, and he stopped in the middle of it and stood, and you could see the deck for what it was now, which was his. There were Vor at the far end. Vor and the Beastmaster and 4 troopers, fallen back to the freight doors, and I understood from the way they stood that the 3 handlers were not coming back, and that these 5 had run out of corridor. They had the only thing the garrison had that could stop a loose drenhound, which was a cutting lance, a thing that threw a line of plasma, and Voron had it up and braced and was not firing it, and I didn't understand that until later either. He wasn't firing because Hesk was between them and the only thing that mattered now, which was the vent. I'll explain the vent, because the whole knife edge of that hour hung on it, and I only learned the shape of it from the comms chatter bleeding through my galley panel while I stood frozen at the hatch. Annex C had a failsafe, the way you'd build into any room where you kept things that could kill you. If a beast got loose and couldn't be retaken, you sealed the deck and you vented it, opened it to the thin yellow nothing outside, and the problem solved itself in the cold and the silence. A clean Vor solution, measured. The trouble was twofold, and I heard both halves come over the panel in that flat command Vor. The first half, the vent control for that whole section had been on the annex side of the peeled door, and Hesk was standing on it. Not cleverly. He hadn't reasoned it out. He'd simply stopped in the one open, warm place on the deck and lain his weight down where the deck was widest, and that happened to be square in the path. To work the vent, they had to clear him off it, and to clear him off it, they had to go past him, and going past him was what the 3 handlers had tried. The second half, and this is the one that put the iron in my stomach, was that the section the vent would empty did not stop at the annex bulkhead. It ran to the next pressure door, and the next pressure door was the one I dogged shut at the far end of my own galley. My galley was inside the section. When they vented it to retake the deck, they vented me with it. I heard a young voice on the panel saying, I thought, the one who named my cat Prey, asked the command channel in that clipped way, whether the cook was clear of the section. And I heard the command channel pause, the kind of pause that is itself an answer, and then say that the section would be vented when the Beastmaster gave the word, and that losses to garrison personnel were noted. Noted. I have never in my life felt so small as I did standing there being noted. Now you'd think a person hearing that would do something, Bang on the door, cry out, pray even if you were the kind. And I'll tell you, I considered all three and did none because I had done the next bit of arithmetic and it came out the same every way I ran it. The freight door end of the corridor, my way out, was past Hesk. There was no past Hesk. And the vent would come when it came, and there was nothing in my galley to stop a drenhound or a command decision. And I was, in the plainest terms, going to die in a corridor over a flour trough, because a beast had lain down in the wrong place, and I'd had the bad luck to bake on third shift. That was the moment, with all of that settled cold in me, that I noticed Nelson was not on the flour. I'd shut him in with me. That was the one mercy I'd thought I'd done, dogging the door, the cat and me together on the safe side, which was now the dying side. And he'd been there. And now the flour stack held only the dent of him, and the serving hatch, the low square hatch I plate the bowls through, the one I'd left up, framed an empty corridor where a small orange shape was walking out into the gray daylight as if he'd heard a tin open. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that got told and retold until it grew a halo it doesn't deserve, and Nelson would be the first to be unimpressed by the halo, if cats could be impressed or unimpressed by anything but lunch. So I'll tell you only what I saw in the order I saw it, and you can make of it what you like. The Vor made a religion of it. I made my peace with never quite knowing. Nelson walked out into the corridor. Not fast. He never did anything fast that wasn't a tin. He walked out into the long gray stripe of dome light, the same unhurried walk he used to cross my galley to complain about supper, the tail up with the little crook at the end, the one eye forward, and he walked toward the thing in the middle of the deck that had killed 3 handlers and stood now over the switch that would empty the air out of all of us. I made a sound. I think I said his name. It came out as nothing. At the far end, Voron saw the cat before I'd finished not saying it. I watched the Beastmaster's crest do something I'd never seen a Vor crest do, drop, all the way flat, which in their grammar I'd learned meant only one thing, the thing they never were, which was at a loss. He didn't fire the lance. He didn't shout the display. He stood with the weapon braced and useless, and watched a half-blind kitchen cat the weight of a sugar sack walk up on his nightmare. And he did the only sane thing left to a creature whose entire world had just stopped making sense, which was nothing at all. Hesk saw the cat at about 10 feet. The big head came round, level, slow, and fixed on the small orange shape, and the plates along the spine lifted, the drenhound display, the thing that meant the same in any language, bigger, louder, above, and Hesk poured it at the cat, the full apex weight of it, the thing that had broken 3 handlers who didn't quite believe they were his master. And Nelson sat down. That was all. 6 feet from a thing that could have taken him in a single closing of the jaws, the old Tom folded down onto his haunches the way he did on the flour sacks, wrapped his tail around his front paws, and looked up at Hesk with the one eye he had left. Not a stare down. I've seen cats square off, and that wasn't it. No flattened ears, no low body, no fight in him anywhere. He simply sat and looked, the way he looked at me when I was slow with the tin, the way he looked at the recycler and the chair and the whole indifferent furniture of the world. The unworried, unhurried, faintly bored look of a creature that has already finished deciding a thing and is only waiting, with no particular interest, to see how long you'll take to catch up. The display ran out of Hesk like water out of a cracked jug. I can't tell it any better than that, and I won't try. The plates came down. The big level head dropped by degrees. The way a thing lowers when the certainty goes out of it, I'd heard that lowering in the handlers an hour before, and here it was again, but quiet and willing, and from the apex of the deck. And Hesk, who had stood above 3 dead men and a Beastmaster and a garrison and the cold yellow world outside, lay down. Front first, the great plated chest folding to the deck, then the haunches, the whole low weight of him settling off the vent and onto the bare plates beside it, where he put his blunt head down between his forelegs and let out a long breath that fogged in the dome cold and went still. He'd taken his place in the hierarchy. He'd been shown the hierarchy in terms he believed, not display, never display, the thing below the display. The true rank and apex thing reads by instinct when the politics fall away, and only the question remains of who, in this room, has nothing left to prove. And the answer, the unbearable cosmic answer that the Vor would spend the rest of my contract failing to write down, was a one-eyed barn cat from a planet they'd called Soft. Nelson watched him lie down. Then, satisfied in the way of a cat that a thing has stopped being interesting, he stood, turned, and walked back toward the galley hatch, tail up, the little crook at the end, and on the way he stopped, I swear this to you, and I've never decided if it was the worst or the best of it. He stopped and sat again by the open vent control, and licked one paw, and drew it over the side of his head where the eye wasn't, twice, the ordinary grooming of an ordinary cat with the day's business done. 6 feet from a war beast lying flat as a rug. And then he hopped the lip of the serving hatch and came back to me and asked, with one short creak of a meow, about supper. It was a long time before anyone in that corridor moved. Voron came down at first, the lance lowered now, walking the way you walk on ice. He gave Hesk a wide berth and the beast didn't lift his head, only rolled the one eye to track him and let him pass, the way a thing that has settled its rank lets the lower orders go about their work. And Voron came to my hatch and stood there, the great crested head and the flat dropped crest, and looked at me, and looked at the cat eating his early breakfast off the cold end of my counter, and looked back at me and asked, and I'll remember the exact clipped shape of it, what the creature was. I told him the same as I'd told San weeks before. That's Nelson, don't mind him. He did not take it for a joke, the Vor never did. He took it, I think, for a name spoken too plainly to be the whole truth, a name that must be hiding a rank, and he asked me what Nelson was on my world, what station, what command, and I understood that he was trying with everything in him to fit what he'd seen into the only frame he owned, the measuring frame, the one where every living thing stood above or below, and he could not make a kitchen cat fit it, and it was breaking something in him to try. So I told him the truth, which I'd found over a long contract was the cruelest thing you could do to a Vor. I said Nelson was nobody. I said he was a stray off a freight pad who decided I was his, and that I fed him from a tin, and that he slept on the flour and was no good for anything, and that he'd lost the eye being a cat somewhere before I ever knew him, and that on my world there were more like him than there were of us, in every house and barn and alley, soft and small and half the time half blind, sleeping in the warm and asking after supper, and that nobody on my whole world would have thought to call him anything at all. Voron looked at the cat for a long time. You let them sleep among you, he said at last. The chest note was gone. There was nothing under his words which for a Vor was a kind of nakedness. Things that can do that. They mostly just sleep, I said. He's not done anything like that before that I know of. He doesn't usually. There's no point telling him to. And there it was, the thing I think put the real cold in the Beastmaster, deeper than the 3 lost handlers, because the handlers he understood, the handlers were rank and risk and the cost of the trade. What he couldn't understand, what none of them ever could, was the carelessness of it. We didn't keep Nelson as a weapon. We didn't keep him as anything. We kept him because he was warm and he was ours and he liked the flour. The most fearsome thing he'd seen in his soldiering life was, to the people who owned it, a thing you tripped over in the dark and apologized to. A garrison broke war beasts in Annex C with discipline and dread and 3 good men, and a soft world fed the same recognition off a tin and named it nobody and let it sleep on the bread. That was the part they couldn't hold, not that we had Nelson, that we didn't even notice we did. They got Hesk back behind a door eventually, though got him back gives the wrong shape to it. He went. Voron walked him, no lance, no display, no chest note, just walked, and the Drenhound rose and followed him low and easy back through the peeled doors into the dark of the annex, settled now, ranked now, a beast that had finally been shown where it stood by the one thing on the deck it believed. They never fully trusted the settling, and they kept a closer watch on the vent after, and I noticed they never again did the display over my flour sacks. They'd come for their bowls and they'd glance at the cat, and they'd glance away. And there was a new thing in the glance that I can only call manners. The manners you keep around a thing whose true measure you've decided you'd rather not take again. The command channel had logged me as a noted loss. They never quite knew what to do about the fact that I wasn't one. There was no form for it. A young officer came round and asked me, very carefully, to describe what the creature had done, and I described it, and I watched him write down, the earth animal entered the engagement zone and the beast pacified. And I watched him sit with that sentence and find it wanting, find that it said nothing of the size of it, and cross it out and try again and give up. Varun, I heard, refused to file a report at all. He said there was no language in it. I think that was the truest thing a Vor ever said in my hearing. They tried, near the end of my contract, to make it into doctrine. That was very Vor too. If a thing has happened that you cannot measure, the next best comfort is to write a rule about it so it can never surprise you again. A delegation came to the galley, 3 of them, grave and crested, and asked whether the cat could be persuaded to walk the annex on a schedule, whether there was a posture, a discipline, a thing he did that could be learned and codified and set down for the breaking of difficult beasts. They wanted, I understood, to bottle the stillness, to make the sitting into a procedure. They had even brought a name for it which they offered to me the way you'd offer a treaty. They wished to call it, in their grave clipped grammar, the stillness that outranks, and to enter it in the annex protocols. And they asked with real ceremony whether the master would consent. The master was asleep on the flower with his paws over his nose. I told them I'd ask him. I went over and I scratched the old Tom under the chin, where the white was, and he creaked his small creak and stretched one back leg out long and shuddering and pulled it in again and went back to sleep without so much as opening the eye. And I turned around and told the delegation, with a straight face, that he'd declined. They took it as a master's prerogative. They wrote that down too. I believe there is, in the protocols of a Vor frontier garrison out past where anyone you'll meet has ever been, a line to this day reserving a discipline they cannot perform, named for a stillness they cannot copy, withheld at the pleasure of an authority who is, at the hour of withholding, asleep in the flower and dreaming, as near as I could ever tell, about absolutely nothing. My contract ran out the next quarter and I took Nelson and the lift to the pads in the long cold way home, and I never went back to Corsenat, and I never told the story straight to anyone who asked, because the straight version doesn't land. People want the beast to have charged and the cat to have stood his ground, want a fight, want a winner. There wasn't any of that. A war beast lay down because a tired old animal sat in front of it and couldn't be bothered to pretend the beast mattered. And the most fearsome thing in a frontier garrison turned out to be a creature so far above the question that it had forgotten the question was being asked. I think about it on the bad nights what it means, that the thing that broke their apex predator was the one we keep precisely because it asks nothing of us and gives nothing back and sleeps 14 hours in the warm. I think they were right to be frightened of us and wrong about why. It was never the guns. It was that we are the kind of people who'll feed that and name it nobody and trip over it in the dark and apologize. Nelson lived 4 more years and died on the flower, old and easy, of nothing but the long arithmetic of cats. I buried him under a real sky, on a soft world, the way you'd want to. He never knew what he was. That was always the whole of it. He just wanted supper. He mostly always got it. That's the full story drafted inline. The file tools, create file present files, aren't available in this chat. So I've delivered everything as text the way we do when the pipeline can't write artifacts. Both tracker updates are below so you can paste them straight into your files.